Hey there, this is Joe Campbell. I don't know if you could see me or just the slides, but hopefully you could see the slides. And this is a talk on the phenomenology of David Hume. I was asked to give a talk on phenomenology. I was working in a project on David Hume, and so I constructed this talk. And then I was no longer, well, it was for a friend, and suddenly I had no use. And I thought the chances of my getting another invitation to talk on phenomenology are remote. So I decided to make this video because I think it's an interesting approach to Hume to see him as a phenomenologist. So I'll talk a little bit about what phenomenology is, and then I'll talk about what I call Hume's atomism. And that we'll understand a little later. But you could see there are a variety of different problems. Those of you familiar with Hume are probably familiar with, like the problem of induction, causation, necessary connection, yada yada, that are kind of involved in this project. Now, of course, I can't talk about all of these in detail uh, in the time that we have. And my main focus is on liberty and necessity. But if you want to understand necessity in Hume, you got to understand causation, and you also have to understand some of the arguments uh, and debates about the nature and existence of God. So, thus, we get a variety of different kind of topics here. But a better way to maybe understand what I'm up to um, is we could think of Hume's concern. We think of Hume, doing phenomenology. Um, his concern then is how do we get from phenomena to philosophical knowledge? As we'll see, phenomena is just the world of experience, possible experience, even. Um, and then I want to show how it'll fall out that Hume makes comments about two different kinds of philosophical claims, what I'll call first level philosophical claims and second level philosophical claims. And first level philosophical claims, these are just standard philosophical claims, like free will conflicts with determinism, or in the language of Hume, liberty conflicts with necessity. Some beings have free will. That's a philosophical claim, claims about personal identity. And then there are debates about the existence of God, whether skepticism is true or false, and yada, yada, yada. And you can see the references there. There are, of all of these debates that I have listed, in fact, Hume literally uses the expression merely verbal when describing the debate. And we'll look in detail with respect to issues about free will and the debate about free will and determinism a little later in the talk. Um, but, a lot of people think, for instance, that Hume is an atheist. I'm not sure that's right, but also that he has a kind of disdain for theism, that he thinks it's dogmatic or unwarranted. I don't think he really shows much disdain for first level philosophical beliefs. I think he criticizes arguments and maybe claims, but not. I think that disdain, though, is in Hume, but it's reserved for what I'm calling the second level philosophical claims, which I think he does regard as dogmatic and unwarranted. But it's not just the claim that God exists, but a claim like that it is demonstrable that God exists. There's some claim about God's nature, that he's both self-caused and supernatural, or not so much the belief in providence in a future state. That's just a sort of first level philosophical claim. But the idea that that's provable, that follows from uh, some kind of philosophical thinking. Um, and then again, maybe not so much the idea that there's mind independent necessity as much as the idea that there's a mind independent necessity that negates free will. I think that's what Hume would object to, or the claim that God necessarily exists. And I think what you see here, some concern Hume has with modal claims, claims about necessity. And we'll look at that, explore that in a little bit more detail. So, what do I mean by phenomenology? I was helped by this article by Dr. Smith from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, who says that there are two versions of phenomenology. We can think of it as a disciplinary field in philosophy or as a movement in the history of philosophy, is that first way that we're going to regard it. So the discipline of phenomenology, he says, may be defined as the study of structures of experience or consciousness. Okay, so now often phenomenology is connected with other areas of philosophy, maybe ontology, epistemology, semantics, ethics. I'm going to discuss Hume and his interest in, this is another quote from Smith, the phenomena on which knowledge claims rest, and specifically philosophical claims to knowledge rest. So, and this phenomena I call Hume's atomism. So let's look at Hume's atomism. And if you're familiar with Hume, you're familiar with Hume's atomism. This is covered in detail in the treatise, but it's also covered in the inquiry. We're going to try to stick with the inquiry as much as we can, although there are a couple passages of the treatise that we're going to have to look at. Um, but Hume says, this is an important passage, everyone will readily allow that there is a considerable difference between the perceptions of the mind when a man feels the pain of excessive heat or the pleasure of moderate warmth, and when he afterwards recalls to his memory this sensation or anticipates it by his imagination. And so Hume divides up, parts of the mind into ideas and impressions, where ideas are thoughts that are less forcible and lively, and impressions are our more lively perceptions when we see, hear, or see, or feel, or love, or hate, or desire, or will. Um, so idea and memories would go in the idea category, whereas particular experiences, the seeing of a cat on a map, go in the impression category. Then he adopts this copy principle. It is impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt, either by our external or internal senses. Okay. And he explains this in more detail earlier in the inquiry. In short, all the materials of thinking are derived either from our outward or our inward sentiment. Or to express myself in philosophical language, all our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. He gives us an example, Golden Mountain. We have the scene of Golden Mountain, but we have the idea of gold, the idea of mountain. These latter we could think of as, simple ideas. I think that's the word I want, but we'll encounter it a little bit later, as opposed to complex ideas. Uh, and the simple ideas we have to have direct impressions of. The complex ideas can be built out of the simple ideas Hume allows. Um, he actually gives a counterexample, this missing shade of blue. But I don't think he doesn't pay much attention to it. Even there, I think, you know, there might be some reasons for criticizing even Hume's sort of atomization of experience. Maybe experience persists through a duration or something, and maybe you know um, colors are supposed to be simple ideas for Hume. So it's a challenge to think how we could have a color we haven't seen. Um, but there might be ways of kind of getting around that. And it's interesting that Hume is not uh, too concerned about this counterexample that he supposes. So I'm just going to share the Humean spirit here and go on from there. I'm actually going to switch to another. I don't know if that's better or worse. Oh, we'll see it. I think it's going to work. I think that's worse. Sorry. Let's try this. So, I'm not going to talk about the association of ideas, although it's important. Uh, so, in addition to the particular ideas, there are ways in which they're associated and these lead um, to other ideas. It's important to to see that Hume was trying to build a science of human nature modeled on Newtonian mechanics. Um, so the ideas of ideas sloshing around or whatever, leading to other ideas, I think Hume is taking somewhat seriously take or Hume did take seriously, and we'll see it manifested a little bit when we talk about causation. But I'm not going to go into too much detail. It's worth mentioning that Hume doesn't you know, define away rationalism with the copy principle because, to say that all of our ideas are based on our impressions, the rationalist notion of an innate idea still would have to be an impression of a certain kind. And so it's not innate ideas per se that Hume is objects to, but the idea that we can get from them to knowledge, as we'll see, I think is going to be a contention that Hume would make. It is a contention he makes. So we can look at Hume's phenomena, and I want to point out a few things about them. And essentially, Hume is just going from Locke. These are just these Lockean ideas, but the term idea for Locke represents any item of the mind. So it covers a lot of ground. So it covers perceptions as well as conceptions. Uh, so just to use some examples, I see the cat on the mat. Here you have an experience, it's a percept or an outward impression. I feel a pain in my leg. This is an experience, a sensation, or inward impression. And notice that percept and sensation are a little bit ambiguous as to whether they're inward or outward. So Hume's terminology is helpful in this regard. Some of the impressions we have we gain by observing the operations of the mind, and some of them we gain by one of the five senses, by observing the world, the external world. And then these Lockean ideas or phenomena are distinct from conceptions or beliefs or judgments. So, I have an idea of the cause effect relation. This is a concept. That also counts. It's in the Hume phenomena. And then not only that, but also judgments. I know that God exists, or even I believe that God does not exist, whatever. These are um, these are items of the mind. This is part of the of Hume's atomism. So propositions and concepts, not just experiences, not just outward and inward experiences. So there's a distinction in the treatise which doesn't come up in the inquiry. I think if you were to look in the inquiry, uh, you wouldn't even find the word knowledge used very much. Um, but if you look in the treatise, at least in the index in the back of the treatise, my version of the treatise, uh, the index has uh, references to this distinction between knowledge and belief. That's important for Hume. And then there are quotations. Actually, I have a next slide um, that kind of map out the distinction. And I try to keep it a little bit more informal here. Um, and essentially, Hume has this, when we think of knowledge versus belief, knowledge is a very highfalutin sort of thing. It only includes things that are intuitively or demonstratively certain. Um, and it arises from intuitive relations between ideas, meaning, you can sort of provide a demonstration or something along the lines of a mathematical proof to illustrate the knowledge. Um, and belief is rather wide ranging, but it just includes, probable belief or opinion, and is distinguished from knowledge because knowledge has a certain level of assurance of certainty. So now notice here, there is a kind of phenomenological appeal. In knowledge, we have this assurance of truth that's lacking in mere belief. But notice belief covers for Hume arguments from cause and effect, arguments arising from probability, arguments arising from calculations of chances. I mean, when you look at this, if you find out that Hume happens to be a skeptic, for instance, well, it's not much of a surprise. I mean, uh, all that counts as knowledge are things that we know with the certainty of 1 + 1 = 2, and well, that's very it's very little is going to fit that is going to turn out to fit that bill. But notice, not science, you know. Um, Now, if you put it that way, it doesn't seem like it's such, you know, a it doesn't seem like a very harmful attack on science. But as we'll see, um, Hume does provide a kind of substantive attack, a more substantive attack than that. And this might be why in the inquiry he changes from talk about knowledge versus belief to talk about different propositional types. Right. So he thinks true propositions fall into one of two categories. Either they're relations of ideas or matters of fact. And relations of ideas are necessary. They can't be false a priori, not a posteriori, not discoverable by experience, and based on demonstrative reasoning. Whereas matters of fact are contingent, knowable only by experience, and based on what Hume calls moral reasoning. Now, moral reasoning is not essentially connected to morality, although I think all reasoning about morality is an instance of moral reasoning for Hume. But moral reasoning really just means the reasonings of human beings. Mortal reasoning would be a better way of maybe thinking of it in contemporary terms. Um, but in any event, it, the distinction is important because it was a distinction that was recognized. Um, so, whether it's true that every proposition is either a relation of ideas or matter of fact, is not really, at least historically, as important as uh, in Hume's time. This was a way of dividing up propositions. On the one hand, you've got like these things that are essentially, relations of ideas end up for Kant being analytic as well, true by definition. So you can understand why they must be true. And this leads to a whole idea that maybe mathematics is true by definition. It turns out to be hard to defend, if not false. But but the idea that the real challenge here is is with moral reasoning. We've got a pretty good idea of how to justify demonstrative reasoning, but moral reasoning in the time of Hume was devoid of that kind of solid grounding that demonstrative reasoning had. So this leads immediately to the problem of induction. Um, you know, you could just find a proposition that's essential to the doing of science, the principle of uniformity of nature, and it turns out to not easily fit in this categorizational scheme. And note this falls out of the phenomenology. Um, so this principle of the uniformity of nature is not a relation of ideas because its denial is consistent uh, and conceivable. The idea that the future will resemble the past uh, is not necessarily true. Things could, gravity could suddenly stop working. It happens in cartoons all the time. I mean, in terms of what's possible or conceivable. But it would be circular to say that pun is a matter of fact, since pun grounds all of our reasoning concerning matters of fact. Um, and now you can make highfalutin claims from this, uh, but it, I think the important thing is not that pun is not established by reasoning, but it's not established by the reasoning of Hume's day. um, Not the theories of the Stoics and Descartes and Locke. And we could look, a little bit at what what Hume disliked about the Stoics and Descartes in particular. Um, so the Stoics had this concept of self-revealing impressions, which are specific experiences like the visual perception of a cat on a mat. Um, and they're also the criterion of truth. And they're clear and distinct. Now, again, a phenomenal property. So judgments about SRIs are infallible according to the Stoics. If one's judgment is that the cat is on the mat, if one's judgment that the cat is on the mat is based on a self-revealing impression, then the cat is on the mat. Okay. Now, similarly, Descartes. Those of you familiar with Descartes probably anticipate what I'm going to say about him, but you could talk about various different this principle, similar principle coming up in Descartes in a variety of different places, but it also comes up in Meditation 4, where it talks about the problem of error. How can God, who is perfect, allow us to be deceived? This is really the chapter where Descartes talks about free will in the meditation. Um, and Descartes' response, our will is infinite, but our intellect is finite. If we only accept that we clearly and distinctly believe to be true, we will never err. So both the Stoics and Descartes make an inference that Hume questions, one based on an immediate inference from a fact, or based on one that is an immediate inference from a fact about our phenomenology to a claim about the mind-independent world. If I clearly and distinctly perceive the P, then P is true. This is something both Descartes and the Stoics believe. And it's inferences along those lines that Hume uh, objected to. So a lot of his problem, a lot of the problem of induction was more about the kinds of inferences that were allowable in Hume's time and Hume's attempt to sort of close that gap. Um, so let's talk about Hume on necessity, and then we'll go to free will. And here is an argument. I think I got it from Beebe. I might have gotten it from other. I'll refer to another article I might have got, but I don't think Hume ever gives this argument. But it's consistent with some Hume terminology. It's an easy argument to understand, and so I thought we'd start with that. So simple versus complex ideas. So I did have the terminology right. Require impressions. We learned this when we were talking about Hume's copy principle. I mean, for Hume, causes precede their effects. I don't think that this is true, has anything, well, whether this has something to do with the meaning of the word cause for Hume, I'm not exactly sure of that. But nonetheless, it is true. Given two at any time, one has an impression of a cause or of an effect, but not both, right? Causes precede their effects. So the causal relation at any given time, you can only have an impression of either the cause or the effect. Ergo, there is no impression of a causal relation. Given one, there is no simple idea of a causal relation. So, what I like about this argument, whether Hume gave it or not, it's kind of Humean in the sense that it goes from, you know, definitions in the case of two, perhaps, but ideas, about phenomenology, um, to and makes a rather substantive claim, um, and in a rather easy kind of way. So it's good to kind of start out with. But now let's look more detail at some comments that Hume has about necessity. I begin with observing that the terms of efficacy, agency, power, force, energy, necessity, connection, and productive quality are all nearly synonymous, and therefore 'tis an absurdity to employ any of them in defining the rest. Then he goes on to say, now that was in the treatise. In the inquiry, it goes on to say there are no ideas which occur in metaphysics more obscure and uncertain than those of power, force, energy, or necessary connection. But this is the important part, of which it is every moment necessary for us to treat in all our disquisitions. So a lot of people think, well, Hume denies that there's a necessary connection, but that can't be true because he thinks it's necessary to in every moment of our disquisitions. So he does believe in a necessary connection, what we might call causation. But he thinks of it in ways differently than we normally think of it. Um, so here are two other helpful, uh, these are actually instances in which Hume is providing a definition of necessity. Um, and one is from the treatise and one is from the inquiry. Here, the passages are nearly identical. There's a little part that's important in the inquiry passage that we'll see. I define necessity two ways conformable to the two definitions of cause, of which it makes an essential part. I place it either one in the constant union and conjunction of like objects, or two, the inference in the mind from the one to the other. Okay. It says nearly the same thing in the inquiry. Notice there's the two parts, constant conjunction, inference of the understanding. But then he also says these senses, which are at bottom the same, blah, 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 he says something else, at bottom the same. Constant conjunction of like objects, the inference and the understanding of one object to the other, are at bottom the same. Let's see how that might be. I think a lot of people just ignore that. They pick one or the other. They certainly don't think that they're the same. And the situation is exacerbated when he goes on in more detail later in the inquiry to talk about causation and provide definitions, because here he gives three definitions. Okay. We had two before, but then there are three now. And, but there's still that first definition and the second definition, because he gives these two definitions. It says, or in other words, between them. So he takes them to be say the same thing. But here's the thing, and we're going to look at these in more detail. I'm not going to read this passage because we're going to take it apart in a minute. But if you look at 1b there, that's a counterfactual. In fact, that is the passage that David Lewis claims where he got the idea for his counterfactual analysis of causation. Well, 1a, that's not a counterfactual, that's just an indicative conditional. And moreover, logically, 1a and 1b are kind of opposed. One has the form like if A, then B, and the other if not A, then not B. So it's a little odd. And what could Hume mean by saying one is other words for the other? But let's take them apart. Let's talk about definition two, which is less complicated first. Uh, let's call this the inference component of causation. Um, so here's what he says. The appearance of a cause always conveys the mind by a customary transition to the idea of the effect. Okay. So, and then in the definition, the second definition, this is a direct quote, an object followed by another, this is a definition of cause, and whose appearance always conveys the thought to that other. And this is very similar to the definition of necessity. And when you define necessity, you said cause was, or that necessity is an important component of cause. And he says the inference of the understanding from one object to another. Now, notice the relation. The definition of cause is asymmetrical. Causes receive their effects, inferring the effect from the cause. But the relation in the definition of necessity is symmetrical. The inference in the understanding from one object to the other. Now, I think that symmetrical idea is really important, and it comes out in that first definition, the constant conjunction part, where Hume says similar objects are always conjoined with similar. And then he gives a definition, but the definitions are distinct. One says, and causes an object followed by another, where objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. So, in plain English, you get something like, if an idea of object, or given an idea of object one, we anticipate a future impression of object two. If object one causes object two, you see the match, striking the flint, you anticipate the ignition the match, the flame. But now here is this counterfactual definition given in cause 1b. An object followed by another where if the first had not been, the second never had existed. Okay, oh, what do we mean here? Given an impression of an object, we presume a previous object had occurred. Because had it not, then the second one would not have occurred, right? Um, and you know, if it wasn't the case, if object one causes object two, then Hume is saying if it wasn't the case that object one occurred, it wouldn't be the case that object two occurred. Thus, you could use, um, you know, or you know, this logic kind of obeys our thinking in terms of providing explanations, appealing to causes to provide explanations. So I think that's sort of what Hume is kind of getting at here, whereas the first one is a little bit easier to understand, the straight indicative conditional kind of captures the idea of the prediction aspect of causation. So now there's one other element, and I'm just going to read this passage because I think it, pulls this thought that I have together, but it adds another wrinkle. It appears then that this idea of necessary connection among events arises from a number of similar instances which occur of the constant conjunction of these events. Nor can that idea ever be suggested by any one of these instances surveyed in all the possible lights and positions. But there is nothing in a number of instances different from every single instance, which is supposed to be exactly similar, except only that after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect the usual attendant and to believe that it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. Nothing farther is in the case. So now notice it's, this connection, the necessary connection, is nothing but the customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant. But then he talks about all this other stuff about repetition and anyway, here's how I want to put it together. And this, I think, connects the two parts, the inference part and the constant conjunction part of causation, and maintains that kind of Hume is in the end doing phenomenology, trying to figure out how we get from phenomena to knowledge. So he wants to say two objects are causally related only if the objects are constantly conjoined, not in the external world, but in our experience of the world. They're conjoined in our phenomenology. And why are they conjoined? Well, they're conjoined, or how are they conjoined? They're conjoined because we draw inferences from judgments about one object to judgments about the other. And we do this in two ways, Hume lets us know. We make predictions and of one, or we use the other in explanations. So there's this inferential component that connects ideas together. When we start making predictions, providing explanations from one idea to the other, voila, we've gotten to causation. Now, I say this is the necessity in causal relation because there's still the idea that causes precede their effects. So it's more than just necessity. And then on top of that, I think Hume gives a psychological explanation, right? So what makes two ideas necessary? Well, they're always connected. Doesn't matter how they're connected or why they're connected, just that they're connected always. Uh, but it's still deserving of an explanation as to why they might be connected. And the general idea is just custom and habit is just you know, we keep striking a match and seeing the ignition, and sooner or later we start to expect the latter upon the former. And when that happens, when we develop that expectation, and also when we feel invited to provide explanations, appeal to past causes, um, we're drawing these kinds of inferences. And at that stage, we've got a causal relation. There's not much more to it. There's nothing more to it for Hume. Okay. Now, I was helped in my understanding of Hume by reading this book by Helen Beebe, Hume on Causation. And she wants to, she divide, well, let's say, and this is true. She notes that the contemporary literature divides up into like three different theories. There are three prominent theories of causation, human causation. So there's the regularity view, that causes are just regularities, but it fails to incorporate the inference component. And also, I'm not sure that Hume was talking about the same kinds of regularities that the regularity view is. I think Hume was talking about a regularity of ideas. One idea followed another. And of course, there are ideas of external objects. I'm not denying that. But that's different than talking about regularities between the objects, the external objects. I think object stands for object of mind, object of phenomena for Hume. And then projectivism, the projection of the ideas, the necessary connection on the world to the world that is a world of brute regularities. This is a quote from Beebe. Um, this, as we'll see, I think, ignores these second level philosophical belief criticisms of Hume. And then we'll also see why skeptical realism won't work. So skeptical realism is the other idea that there are these necessary connections in the world, but we don't have knowledge of that. But I think this is inconsistent with what Hume says about the problem of liberty and necessity. And so I want to advocate this inference view. Uh, all causes are the same, all necessities are the same. Causation is a kind of necessity, and all necessity is the necessity of inference, a connection between objects of experience, phenomena. So, and I think what's really important here is that idea that the connection of necessity with inference. So it's very similar, I think, as we'll see. One of the points, and Hume makes a lot in his conversations about liberty and necessity, is that there's a confusion, what Boethius called this confusion between um, the necessity of the consequence and the necessity of the or conditional necessity, or really is a confusion between an absolute and conditional necessity. So determinism is a conditional necessity between uh, the past and the future via the laws of nature. Um, and and all necessity for you, as it turns out, is going to be conditional then. There are no, this is a kind of Quinean view, I think, if you think about it a little bit more. Anyway, let's move on. Now, uh, if we went over the details of the cosmological argument, we take three times as less time as we would as if we didn't. So I'm gonna skip over it, but I'm gonna talk about it, like the structure, because I think it gives us a good idea of what Hume is up to. So notice here, and what Hume doesn't like about this. I mean, what he doesn't like is you have one premise, and it seems for Hume to be something along the lines of a relation of ideas, because it's necessary, right? Whatever exists must have a cause or reason of its existence. And uh, if we haven't seen already, I think it's clear that Hume believes this. He believes that PSR is true. So he's not going to respond to the cosmological argument by denying that. But we get from the truth of PSR, arguably, say, a relation of ideas, to a claim about existence, God's existence. And it's just two applications because, there's a disjunction that supposedly follows from PSR, and then you rule out one of the disjuncts by appeal to PSR. So PSR is doing the only logical work in the premises, is the only real premise, and but we get this claim of existence, which is a claim Hume wants to say, that's well, what Kant would say synthetic is, it should be a matter of fact for Hume. And so one of the things that Hume does is he gives a criticism, a sort of general criticism against such a thing possibly happen. Nothing is demonstrable unless the contrary implies a contradiction. Nothing that is distinctly conceivable implies a contradiction. Whatever we conceive as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. There is no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. Consequently, there is no being whose existence is demonstrable. So again, here, you know, the criticism is not that God can't exist, but that you can't provide a demonstration of the existence of God. But then he continues for people who know, he says, have a pretended, who accept this pretended explication of necessity. So what he wants to say is, look, there's a pretend kind of notion of necessity here going on, not one that's going to produce the results that the argument suggests. And this is just what Hume is saying. I'm not saying that that's true, but I'm just saying that's Hume's view on the topic. And then, but then he goes on and he continues. And then I'm not going to get into the detail, but the next two criticisms itself provide a constructive dilemma against the argument. But more importantly, he ends with this, with this idea that this pretended explication of necessity eventually will lead to necessitarianism. As we'll see, this is one of the criticisms I think he gives of really the kind of necessity used in the consequence argument for incompatibilism. We'll take a little peek at that. So I'm not going to go over this constructive dilemma, but it is interesting. And then one other thing I have to talk about in terms of Hume's philosophy of religion, because this is the best instance, I think, of what I'm calling, Hume's criticism of the second level philosophical claims. I think it comes out most clearly in in his discussion. This is actually discussion from Inquiry 11, which is a discussion on providence and the future state. And I've been helped by this volume by Stapleford and Goldschmidt. And that's a really great volume. It's a collection of the inquiry, but what they do is they expand on the passages to help the contemporary reader. And it was primarily intended for students, but I can tell you, I don't think I ever understood what was going on in Inquiry 11 until I read this expanded version. And then they notice a fallacy they call the sprouting cause fallacy that Hume criticizes. And this is an example of the kind of second level criticism that I'm talking about. If you think that the appearances of things prove such causes, it is allowable for you to draw an inference concerning the existence of these causes. But here you ought to rest. If you come back and arguing from your inferred causes conclude that any other fact has existed or will exist in the course of nature, which may serve as a fuller display of particular attributes, I must admonish you that you've departed from the method of reasoning attached to the present subject and have certainly uh, added something to the attributes of the cause beyond what appears in the effect. So the argument is about, we'll come back to this other passage in a second, but just to give you an idea, he's talking about, um, you know, using the, or sorry, using the design argument to establish that God exists. And then, that indicates a certain kind of lot, you have to abide by the rules of I think there's an argument by analogy for Hume. So you have to uh, abide by the rules of arguments by analogy in order for the argument to work. But then attempts to kind of go beyond that to some other claim, such as God has a providential plan, that's where Hume is going to find some problem. Let's read this passage and then we'll look at that other uh, slide in more detail. So here's another quote from um, from Hume. All the philosophy, therefore, in the world and religion, and all the religion, which is nothing but a species of philosophy, will never be able to carry us from the usual course of experience or give us measures of conduct and behavior different from those which are furnished by reflections on common life. No new fact can ever be inferred from the religious hypothesis, no event foreseen or foretold, no reward or punishment expected or dreaded beyond what is already known by practice and observation. So, so this is the kind of thing that Hume wants to object to, and there's an instance of that causing sprout fallacy. So you start with observations of an effect in need of explanation. An elegant world exists. From this, you infer a cause that adequately explains the effect. An intelligent creator exists. Now, this is just the design argument up to this stage, and it yields first level belief. And as critical as Hume was of the design argument, it's worth noting two things. In you know in dialogues concerning natural religion, at the end, he accepts an abbreviated version of it. And he presents versions of it as if he accepts them or they're obvious or something, uh, a lot in the natural history of religion, very often, and in other works as well. My own view is that I think that Hume thought that there was something very seductive about the design argument, and it had a kind of causal effect, noting the beauty of the universe tended to cause people to believe that God existed. Now, I don't think he gave much rational credence to that personally. But again, I don't think that first level belief was all that objectionable to Hume. And there's reason for thinking maybe Hume, in fact, was a theist himself anyway. But it's the continuation, build up the cause with fanciful additions. By fanciful additions, we just mean those that are beyond the observations used to establish the original conclusion in that first argument. You say God, the creator God, is perfect and just. That doesn't follow from the evidence of the universe. Just the mere elegance of the universe doesn't entail that God is, or even make probable that God is perfect and just. That must be another kind of inference that you're drawing. But then you go back to the world, so to speak, infer new effects that outstrip the original observations. You start to make practical proclamations. God has a providential plan because the world is unjust. And it's interesting because to the extent that this criticism works, it works as a criticism of Kant's moral argument. This is just another instance. The ontological argument is one instance in which, or no, I forget what the other is. Hume kind of proceeds, like gives criticisms of Kant's arguments before Kant gives them. But I think this is a criticism of the moral argument. I think it makes this sprouting clause fallacy, but that's another issue. And and then here is one of these examples I alluded to before, just to close this discussion of religion, in which Hume claims there's a verbal dispute. And now this is quite a contentious claim, right? That the atheism theism debate is a verbal dispute. But listen what he says. I'm apt to suspect there entertains somewhat of a dispute of words into this controversy, more than has usually imagined. That the works of nature bear a great analogy to the productions of art is evident, and according to all the rules of good reasoning, we ought to infer, if we argue it all concerning them, that their causes have a proportional analogy. But as there is also a considerable differences, there uh, then the existence of a deity is plainly ascertained by here. Then the existence of the deity is plainly ascertained by reason. And if we make it a question whether, on account of these analogies, we could probably call him a mind or intelligence, notwithstanding the vast difference which may be reasonably be supposed between him and human minds, what is this but a mere verbal dispute? I mean, he goes on to say that even atheists will recognize a certain order to the universe. So everybody accepts that the universe is governed by a kind of rational order of sorts. Whether they think those properties are enough to deserve it, worthy of the name God, that comes in. If we think of it that way, that's a verbal dispute. Now, I wouldn't say that all disputes, religious disputes, can be this easily worked out, but it would follow even just from this much that sometimes when people are in dispute about whether theism or atheism is true, the dispute is merely verbal. They really have the same view in mind. They're just giving it a different name. And we'll see that live in action in the next example when we start looking at liberty and necessity. So here's a kind of second attempt at a take on this distinction between first and second level belief. For Hume, we share a common phenomenology, start with the same data in our search for knowledge. Many first level philosophical disputes are merely verbal, so we are allowed to indulge in the liberty of conjecture when it comes to these philosophical beliefs. I think Hume actually did believe that. I don't think he really cared too much about whether people were theists or atheists or whatever. Also, inferences from world to God are allowable, subject to usual standards of argument and evidence. The design argument is okay if it passes the standards of argument and evidence. Hume mainly objects to second level belief, for instance, reasoning from God to world. This I get from Goldschmidt, etc. et al. Claiming that there must be future justice given God's perfect nature, judgments exceeding their previous evidence for theism. Meaning the expressions world to God, God to world come from Stapleforth and Goldschmidt. So that's an original take. Last issue, necessity and free will. So Hume has two discussions, one in the treatise and one in the inquiry. They both have two parts. So it's treatise 2, 3, 1, and 2, and inquiry 8, part 1 and 2. And in the first part of both, he gives what I'm calling an argument for determinism. I mean, you can call it what you want, but it succeeds in proving determinism. Remember, when if he says physical necessity, it just means like physical determinism, or moral necessity means necessity about human action, um, or determinism about human action. And what he shows is that everybody accepts physical necessity, and whatever's on the same footing at that must also be necessary. And then he shows that human action is on the same footing. And this comprises the first part of both the treatise and the inquiry. Um, and so a lot of work is done supporting that premise that human action is on the same footing. And I'll explain what he means by that in a second. But and then it follows that willful actions. So uh, there is physical necessity. Whatever's like that is also a kind of necessity, and human action is like that. So there's moral necessity too. That's kind of the structure of the argument. And again, it appears in both places. Um, but in the discussion of liberty, uh, that's different. So in Hume's treatise, um, the word liberty generally stands for the liberty of indifference. So he uses phrases like indifference or liberty. And he says explicitly, according to my definitions, necessity makes an essential part of causation, and consequently, liberty, by removing necessity, removes also causes. And there's the very same thing with chance, as chance is commonly thought to imply a contradiction, as at least directly contrary to experience. There are always the same arguments against liberty or free will. So free will is what I'm calling liberty of indifference. And what's really important about that is liberty of indifference is incompatible with determinism. I'm even going to talk about it in more detail other than just noting that it's incompatible with determinism. Um, and Hume does make this distinction. He talks about a little bit more detail um, between indifference and spontaneity. Few are capable of distinguishing, though, he says, betwixt the liberty of spontaneity, as called in the schools, the liberty of indifference. But here's what he says about them both: betwixt that which is opposed to violence, that's spontaneity, and that which means a negation of necessity and causes. So he's really just defining, although liberty of indifference is more robust, I won't go into it now. Um, he's just defining it as he's thinking of it just as a kind of incompatibilist liberty. That's all that's really that's the sole content that it has in the inquiry. I mean, absent its historical context. Uh, but here's what we get in the inquiry in terms of liberty. By liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. And this is very similar to the definition of will that he gives in the treatise. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. And if we choose to move, we may also. Now, this hypothetical liberty is usually allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Here, there is no subject of dispute. Now, one thing I want to say is people often will associate hypothetical liberty here with the hypothetical analysis it could have done otherwise, and people then assert that Hume is some kind of leeway compatibilist, which I don't may or may be true, but I don't really see much evidence for. What I want to point out is it's not a power of doing A or B, it's a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations. We may move or remain at rest. Okay. And I think that's it's not a power about choices, or the choice is not about different actions, or the alternatives are not about different actions, but acting or not. I think that's significant, but I digress. He also says liberty, when opposed to necessity, not to constraint, is the same thing with chance, which is universally allowed to have no existence. So, if not hypothetical liberty, I don't think he does not use liberty of indifference. It's just any old liberty that is opposed to necessity uh, is just chance, and so doesn't exist. Uh, that all mankind have ever agreed to the doctrine of liberty as well as that of necessity, and that the whole dispute in this respect has also hitherto merely verbal. So he says of the dispute between liberty and necessity that it's merely a verbal dispute. And now what's interesting is that he doesn't just say that, but he shows it by actually giving different solutions, but using the same arguments to establish those two different views. So in the treatise, he says determinism is true, including moral necessity, right? Gives that argument, does the same in the inquiry. But liberty is the liberty of indifference, and determinism is inconsistent with liberty of indifference. Ergo, the conclusion is determinism and no liberty. He's a hard determinist in the treatise. In the inquiry, he changes the definition. Liberty now stands for hypothetical liberty. Determinism is consistent with hypothetical liberty and determinism and liberty. He takes the position of soft determinism, where the soft determinist thinks that determinism is true and we have free will. So he kind of illustrates the verbal dispute, which I think is interesting. And then, moreover, there's a kind of potential verbal dispute with respect to necessity. On the one hand, there is necessity as we just analyze it, human necessity, necessity as ideas that are conjoined, inferred. And Hume shows in both these works that that's relevant to morality and religion. So it isn't just that he advocates this other kind of necessity, but he shows that it's relevant to morality and religion, and gives reason, whether we accept those reasons or not, it's another matter, but gives reasons for thinking that uh, this other kind of necessity uh, is not uh, currently relevant to morality and religion. I'm not sure that last point is what I wanted to say, but let's look at this other kind of necessity, mind independent necessity. It is universally allowed that matter is actuated by a necessary force, and that every natural effect is so precisely determined by the energy of its cause that no other effect could possibly have resulted from it. So one might respond to Hume's compatibilism by just refusing to give the name of necessity to the property of act, by saying necessity is mind independent necessity, and that does not apply to human action, and then maintaining it's possible to discover something further in the operations of matter, namely this mind independent necessity. So in other words, people supposedly can just ignore Hume because they allege that no, real necessity is not what you claim it is, but it's a kind of connection between external objects. That's what I'm calling mind-independent necessity. Um, and it's interesting the role that mind-independent necessity plays in this debate. It appears, I think, in the consequence argument as well. And Hume gives a version of that in the inquiry toward the end. There is a continued chain of necessary causes, preordained and predetermined, reaching from the original cause of all to every single volition of every human creature. No contingency anywhere in the universe, no indifference, no liberty. He goes on actually to show that, therefore, either there is no blame because all causes trace back to God, or God is the cause of all blame, um, or God is blameworthy for all evil. Um, but these, uh, the whole case against incompatibilism rests on our having, this mind independent necessity. And in the treatise, Hume gives an assortment of arguments. These are really good argument. A really good book called Powers, article in there on Powers in the Modern Era by Lordo. Lordo. That's very good. And then she shows how, we can ask of this mind independent necessity, is this simple or complex? And it seems like it must be simple, but we actually gave a reason for thinking that, the necessity in a causal relation can't be uh, a simple idea. Um, and, you know, is min derived from our inner sense or from our external sense? Hume makes a case, I'm not going to run through it, but that neither is sufficient. The argument is very similar. Those of you who are familiar with Hume's criticism of personal identity, you look at all the options given the phenomenology. What are the options? There's just a finite number for Hume. And he just shows how this idea can't be sustained in any of these. So those who deny human necessity make this last move that we looked at and just claim that no, it's not human necessity does not apply to actions. It's some kind of mind independent necessity. And if that applied to actions, it wouldn't be free. They must show that we have an idea of something else in the actions of matter, which, according to the foregoing reason, is impossible. So I think the structure of Hume's main argument here is that if determinism were a demonstrable threat to free will, we would have a precise idea of a mind independent necessity. But it's impossible to formulate such an idea. Ergo, determinism is not a threat. Um, what we have is the ability to make predictions, give explanations. That's a kind of conditional necessity that pertains between judgments about the past and judgments about the future. And then, last example of a verbal dispute is often given also given in the dialogues. The instance of the of theism, atheism being a verbal dispute that came from dialogues. Well, this comes from a two, but it's in a footnote. Uh, the dispute between the skeptics and dogmatists is entirely verbal, or at least regards only the degrees of doubt and assurance which we ought to indulge with regarding all reasoning. No philosophical dogmatist denies that there are difficulties both with regard to the senses and all of science, and that these difficulties are in a regular logical method absolutely insolvable. No skeptic denies that we lie under absolute necessity, notwithstanding these difficulties of thinking and believing and reasoning with regard to all kinds of subjects, and even of frequently assenting with confidence and security. The only difference then between these sects is that the skeptic, from the havoc, caprice, or inclination, insists mostly on the difficulties, the dogmatists, for like reasons, on necessity. So, concluding remarks, Hume was interested in the connection between phenomena, items of experience, and consciousness. That's what I mean by phenomena, and knowledge, especially philosophical knowledge. So, how do we get from phenomena, the items of experience and consciousness? And again, there's no empirical bias here because, uh, the rationalist is going to also have items of experience and consciousness to work with. How do you get from those atoms to knowledge, especially philosophical knowledge? Phenomena include experiences of both the external world and the operations of the mind, concepts and sensations, opinions, and warranted judgments. Hume held that many first order philosophical disputes are merely verbal. He also thought that second order philosophical disputes are problematic whenever we take first order belief as an item of knowledge and draw inferences about the world that go beyond the evidence of first order belief. Here are references, and thank you for your time. Feel free to share questions.